All right, so we are now going to move from constructing a circle graph into interpreting a circle graph. So what we have is the Bowman's monthly budget is $5,000. How much more money is spent on food and clothing than entertainment? Okay, so before we get started, let's understand that when we're looking at a circle graph, you're looking at 100% or the population. And so the population here is the amount of money that's being spent throughout the month. So, for example, our food and clothing, we're spending 40%, or the Bowman's family is spending 40% of the 5,000. So, this represents that 5,000 inside of here. And each one of these sections represents the percentage of the 5,000 that's spent throughout the month. Okay, so let's look and see. The question that they ask us is how much more money is spent on food and clothing than on entertainment. So, a clue word is how much more. That lets me know that we're using subtraction. And so, what are we comparing? Well, in this case, it says how much more money is spent on food and clothing. So, I'm going to put food and clothing. So, we're spending more on food and clothing um, than on entertainment. So, we're going to subtract out entertainment. And when we do that, we're going to find the difference between the two. Okay. And because we mentioned food and clothing first, that means that we're spending that much more on food and clothing than we are on entertainment. So let's now find the values that go with that. Okay, so remember this represents 100% of the $5,000. Okay, so let's see what we're going to start off with. We could set it up as proportional relationships like we've been doing, but I am going to also show you a different way on how you could figure out something like this. So remember, I want you to work smarter, not harder. So hopefully, this helps you to feel like you're working smarter. However, if you find that sticking with the proportional relationships, and setting it up as the fractions or ratios like we've been doing is easier for you, then go ahead and go for it. All right, so what we're doing is we're talking about the food and clothing and the entertainment. So let's see what food and clothing is. Food and clothing was 40%. And I'm just going to put over here so we know this is in terms of percents, okay? So we spent 40% on food and clothing, and now we're going to subtract out how much we spent on entertainment, which is 4%. So that means we spent 36% more on food and clothing. So what about the values? Because they ask us how much. Well, remember, um, these percentages represent a percent of the whole, which is 5,000. So they spent 36% of 5,000 on food and clothing more than they did on entertainment. So let's see what that looks like. So 36% of 5,000. So remember that clue word of means that you are multiplying. So 36%, I'm just going to write that down. Of means that we're multiplying 5,000. So it may look something like this when you first write it out. Now what I need to do is convert my percent to a decimal. Okay. And so going back to what we remember, 36%, to turn it into a decimal, you drop the percent, replace it with the decimal, and then you just move it two places to the left. So that's one and two. And the reason for that is because basically what you're doing is per means each 100, right? So this, what you did was divided by 10, you divide it by another 10, right? So two sets of 10 becomes 100. So essentially what you did was divide it by 100. That's what you just did. So our answer is going to be here. It's going to be 0.36. That's the same thing as 36%. And then we're going to multiply that by 5,000. So we're going to say 0.36 times 5,000. And that gives me 1,800. So they spent $1,800 more on food and clothing than they did on entertainment. So that's your answer for this problem.